Good to see everybody. How are you? Happy Sunday night. We're going to go ahead and get started so John has maximum amount of time to go ahead and clear all this up for us. But an announcement I forgot to make at 11 o'clock is for next Sunday, which is the pre-Thanksgiving Thanksgiving service. So we will have at least 20 military soldiers here, at least 15 to 20 college students, plus our own church family. We'll have plenty of turkey, but we need sides and desserts for a Thanksgiving dinner. And that's going to be the program. That'll start at 5:30 next week, not 6. If you come at 6, you'll still be fine. But we're going to make 5:30 to 6:30 the dinner, so that's the focus of next week. No service tonight afterwards, no service next week after the dinner. Because next week, again, we want this just to be a relaxed Thanksgiving dinner where we're hosting, again, some of our military and college students who can't get home because they're here. So I just wanted to make that announcement. Thank you to John, and I'll turn it over. John Van Doorn, Dr. John Van Doorn, everybody, let's give him a hand.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Okay, well, I'm so excited that you all are here, and the main thing I really want to do tonight is try to give a little more context to an extremely complicated situation and to invite your discussion, invite your feedback. So I'm going to try to go as quickly and as clearly as I can to lay the table so that we can discuss at least a few of these framing questions that you'll see up front. So if we can move on, I thought I'd start with a quote here from way back when in the Ottoman Empire, with one of these characters who thought that they were a sultan or they were like a sultan, and I think that the president of Turkey sees himself this way now, that he's kind of taking care of wayward children, and that's why he's doing sort of what he's doing. That, I've done all these things for them, and if I leave them alone, well, they'll just be left to their disorders, and I've saved them from that. We'll see if that's the case or not. Well, I wanted to try to locate this visually, so I've got, with Gary's help, just about a 2.5-minute video clip, which is often worth 1,000 words, just 2.5 minutes so that we can then get quickly into the rest of the presentation. Okay, so let's move along. That just kind of quickly introduces the pathos and the tragedy of this moment. But what I'd like you to think of is this is not just a crisis of the day, it is a long-standing plight that the Kurds have found themselves in for hundreds of years, and not just this year, although this is a particularly extreme moment in northern Syria for those who were trying to create a new, almost idealistic Kurdish homeland called Rojava, which we will talk about here in a little bit more detail. Okay, here are some of the questions to think about. I'm not going to read them all right now, but for you to think about as we go through these slides. Are the Kurds just another Middle Eastern tribe? And if not, what makes them special? And what do they mean by this social contract in this area that they called Rojava, which essentially just means Western Kurd lands in their language? Should the U.S. continue to promote or abandon its founding principles in the Middle East? And of course, those are principles of democracy, civil liberties, civil rights, humanitarianism. Those have been some of the reasons the United States has been a shining beacon, and it makes our foreign policy very strong. And certainly since Reagan, it has been our ideal to promote self-representation, democracy. Before that, of course, with Woodrow Wilson, was the idea of self-determination. The point, the word that I've got bolded there, I'd like you to remember, it's called irredentism. And this is the idea that every nation should be in a state. So a lot of confusing terminology, but the way I use the word nation is a self-identified group of people who want to be together and who want to have political independence, meaning they want to have their own state. That's what a nation is. A state is a territorial piece of land in which there is at least a recognized government under international law. And the government has to do several things, but that's essentially what a state is in international relations, international law. So irredentism is this idea that our nation has been trapped across different state borders, and we want to reunite them all in at least one state. Maybe we could have several. And that's essentially what the Kurds want. And we'll see that's a very difficult thing to achieve in that particular neighborhood where they're stranded across at least 4 states and really across 6. Another little thing you might remember about international relations is ever since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, no state has willingly given up 1 square inch of its territory. And so you have really a rock and a hard place where you have these 2 irreconcilable, ideas, the states that exist and the ideal of a nation state, a Kurdistan for all Kurds in that area. A question that I hope that I can maybe shed some light on particularly is the one that is bouncing in here, and that is there a better way to structure power transitions in war-torn areas, especially these Kurdish areas? I would suggest that there are better ways than what we're doing now, and we'll put on our creative thinking caps and think about how, and this will happen again. Again, it's a recurring cycle, it's a plight, so how can we do it maybe better next time? And then another question which has really haunted international relations really since the Treaty of Westphalia is, are there certain areas of the world where nation states just really don't work? That is the Western idea of a juridical nation state, nice clean lines on a map, but you've got all these messy intermixed tribes and groups. And maybe the Middle East is one of those areas where crisp lines on a map don't really work out all that well. We might go back to the future. We might go back to a time of empires where there were loose borders, so there was understandings, but there were not these territorial clashes based right upon a line in the sand, literally. Okay, so keep some of those things in mind. Of course, the bottom line is, what can we as private citizens do about this situation? And I'll make some suggestions, and we have some handouts as well. There is a group of evangelical Presbyterians that are in this area. They've sent out an urgent newsletter. They ask that we don't cite it on the internet or cite it because they could be in danger, but there are some connections that you can follow up if you're interested in doing something else. Prayer is important, but something specific you might do to help these groups. Okay, so let's locate the Kurds in a little bit broader Middle Eastern geopolitics. And gosh, we can do this in just a few minutes, shall we? I started off with 60 plus slides and I got it down to much fewer, but I tell you, this is something. So we'll do the best we can. All right, this is a region in which the geostrategic position makes the most difference in political economic outcomes. If you know your history well, you know that the Middle East, you can almost put a cross on it, is the crossroads between north and south and east and west, right? This was, in the Hebrew language, it was Hayam Hamagiddo, which we translated into Armageddon. That's where the end of the world will probably occur. I hope not, but it might be. The Romans called it Via Maris, the way of the sea. And so, the traders going from the east through the Mediterranean, out that way, also going to the west, going to the east on the Silk Road, people coming from Africa up to Europe. This really is the crossroads of the world. Then you add oil on top of that, and you have the recipe for an area that's going to be riven with conflict, and where the strategic points, the rivers, the gulfs, the high points, like Golan Heights, those are all going to be fought over because they make such a difference in outcome and geostrategic position. Now you add to that, and I just added that point about the crossroads, there was a theory that was advanced by a well-known IR, international relations scholar, about 150 years ago, and he called it the heartland of the world island. His name was Mackinder, and he was a Scottish writer, very influential. He influenced Theodore Roosevelt, among other people, and he said basically, he who controls the Middle East controls the heartland, and he who controls the heartland of the world island, he called this the world island, controls the world. And so he said that whatever you do, particularly talking to the West, the United States, particularly Britain, France, try to control the Middle East, because then you'll have the ability to control the balance of power. That's what my little slides here are, the chessboard here, the great power game of thinking about the world in global terms. So it certainly, at least since then, since Theodore Roosevelt on forward, thinkers in the foreign offices and the Department of Defense and State have thought about how do we gain the strategic advantage in the Middle East. Of course, we know it's the Holy Land for the three great religions of the world. If you've been to the Middle East, been to Jerusalem particularly, you see the influence of Christianity and Muslim and Zoroastrianism and some of the other great religions of the world right there. There are a lot of nomadic tribes, and this makes it even more difficult because in Western law, we like to think of people can claim title, right, title to land because they live in this nice little square piece of property and they have a nice clean record going back, however far to say, okay, this is mine, I deserve state protection. But a lot of folks, because water was scarce, because it was not easy to live off that small piece of land, they were nomadic. So claims to land are hard to prove. The Kurds, like the Palestinians, another stateless nation, they have had to fight for recognition because they don't have, going back maybe centuries, nice clean titles to particular plots of land. It's just not the way that they operated. Of course, we had oil discovered just about 100 years ago, 20s, 30s in most area, and that really made it very valuable, and the West became extremely interested in extracting what the world still runs on, is oil and oil products. We've had the great game, and I kind of mentioned that a little bit at the point about Mackinder. But the great game was always to see how you could use the twin forces, I don't have it there, but the twin forces of nationalism, religion. What are the things that really motivate people? Well, religion and nationalism, who you are, your fundamental identity, what's your religion, which God you pray to. So if one force got too strong, maybe national identity, then come back at it with religion. And, one of my favorite examples is how the British plucked this obscure cleric named Wahhab from the deserts of Saudi Arabia. They supported him, and so Sunni Muslim, which was it was fairly, it was mild, it was tolerant, became very intolerant and very jihadish, if as you will, jihadist in the sense of outward conflict. And so that became the ruling religion of Saudi Arabia. And then Saudi Arabia has exported this Wahhabism around the Middle East, and it really is the foundation for so many groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth that, to me, are not recognizable as Muslim. This is not the way I read the Quran. This is not the foundational teachings, that you tolerate the other people of the book, right? Of the book means Old Testament, New Testament, Quran. So if they're Jewish and they're Christian, they are to be at least tolerated and maybe even celebrated. But in these Wahhabist, I would say, perversions of Sunni Islam, they are to be converted or driven away. The Kurds are, interestingly, Sunni Muslims, as we're going to see, but they're not that kind of Wahhabiyas type of Sunni Muslim. Okay, political institutions. We have an interesting thing called sultanism, and again, this would be worth 2 full lectures if we had time. It's a distinct kind of rule. It's not a typical Latin American dictator who just wants to have the power of the state but leaves the economy alone. It's kind of, imagine an old wagon wheel, if you will, and at the center of the spoke is the sultan, and everything in society, be it social, religious, economic, it all has to go through the sultan. And as long as the sultan gets tribute from every aspect of life, then the sultan is basically happy. And this makes it difficult to deal with folks who think that they should have their finger in every pie. Now, I see Erdogan some ways that way, but he's also becoming increasingly repressive, and we'll talk about reasons why he's becoming more repressive and less like a sultan. But you combine a dictator with a sultan, and you've got a pretty difficult to deal with character. There is little separation of religion and state. That's one of our founding principles, as we know. It doesn't actually say separation of church and state, but we have freedom of religion, particularly in in the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And this is not a principle that's over there. So again, it's difficult to separate. We know with Iran, the theocracy, how difficult they are to deal with, but in many other states, it's the same way, that overlay. I think our founders understood that when you intermix religion and politics, it corrupts both, it degrades both, And it also leads to a kind of religion which is not necessarily coming from within, but is imposed from without. And this is something that the Kurds, at least in Rojava, believe as well. They believe in religious toleration, and they believe that you should have the ability to practice your own religion free of external imposition. And I think it's one of the things that makes them pretty interesting. Arab nationalism. You had the Ba'athist movement, and that was particularly important in both Iraq and Syria. The last practitioner of Ba'athism is Bashar al-Assad, who is the brutal, dictator of Baghdad, and we can see does not mind slaughtering his own people. We saw him briefly there on the video. Saddam Hussein was a fellow practitioner, and this is a really strange kind of combination of fascism and Arab nationalism. But the idea for us here is that you're absolutely ruthless, right? You crush any dissent using all the means of the state, mechanized warfare, chemical warfare. You don't tolerate dissent. And again, we can see the consequences of it with Assad. But it was also part of the great game. This was nationalism to counteract the religious uprising. And when you unleash these forces, it's literally like unleashing a Pandora's box, isn't it? And we still see that today. Okay, women have been largely excluded from public life. Wonderful book by Bernard Lewis, and he suggests that may be one reason why the economics and the politics of these areas are chronically underdeveloped, at least as we would see them. If more women were involved in public life, be it politics or economics, then you would probably see a much more vibrant civil society. You would see much more development in all these spheres. But the way that religion is interpreted in a lot of these places is that women are supposed to be seen but not heard from. And again, that makes it difficult. Again, the Kurds thought differently about this, and that's one reason I put that up there. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through all of this. In foreign policy, we have real problems dealing in this area. It's resistant to our usual approaches. Because of the sultanistic approach, people like Erdogan and Assad and so forth, Gaddafi before him, and we have diffuse and competing centers of power. So really the struggle to be what we call a hegemon, the dominant power in this area, is between these states: Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt. The two that are the strongest competitors are Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you can explain much of the proxy warfare and the bloodshed by the desire. Remember, Saudi Arabia is Sunni Muslim, Iran is Shia Muslim, and they have a lot of other cleavages or divides that go back just centuries and centuries. But we also have on the eastern end, we have Pakistan. We have on the western end Turkey, which once again is wanting to dominate its region. And so the United States has, if you're friends with any one of them, you tend to be an enemy of another, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, maybe. And so there's no real easy way to deal with any of these states. They're all kind of zero-sum, struggling for dominance. Now, the biggest phenomenon that happened there was the Arab Spring, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but essentially that was the idea of democracy, of freedom, of liberalism, of civil liberties that started in Tunisia, and it seemed to be spreading like a wonderful human wave. The great thing, it was not just U.S. foreign policy coming from above, it was a genuine unleashing of civil society, an unleashing of the people themselves who yearn to be democratic in their daily lives, sort of anti-sultanism in politics, in the economy, in the society. And for a while there it seemed to catch, but unfortunately it met kind of a tragic outcome in Syria, which again affects our friends the Kurds. So we'll get a little bit back to the post-Arab Spring in a little while. Okay, so quickly, let's talk about who are these people called the Kurds. Estimates widely vary, anywhere from 25 million to 40 million, but even if you take the lower end, around 30 million, this is one of the largest stateless nations in the world. Much larger than the Palestinians that number just a few million. We usually hear a lot more about the Palestinians than we do about the Kurds, and maybe that's not right because there's just a lot more of them. They are semi-nomadic mountain dwellers strewn across 6 states, as I'll show in a map. Not just Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, but also Armenia, Iran, and Georgia. That is the other Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And they make up about 10% of the Syrian population. So, that's not an inconsequential group. That is what's left of the Syrian population at this point. They are Sunni Muslim, although they've kind of gone back and forth at different times in their history. They do tolerate Christians. There are only about 3% of them or so that are Christian, and maybe the other 7-8% are just simply don't have any religion at all. But I think they've seen religion kind of more pragmatically, right? They've seen religion as something that they will use or go along with as part of their, national fabric, but their national identity is more important. And I hate to make huge generalizations, but generally it's more important than the religion. About 50,000 Christians live in Rojava, that is North Syria. And so that gives us an idea of the number of Christians that we're talking about here. Okay, here is a map. It's not great. It actually, if you've got sharp eyes, misidentifies Lebanon is Israel. So that's not good. But I like this particular one because it is uncluttered. It shows us very clearly where are the Kurds the dominant group and where are they less. So again, if you see it, you can see that they're dominant in eastern Turkey, along the border, the mountainous border between Iraq and Iran, and then coming into North Syria. But they also go up into Armenia and even up into the state of Georgia. So the reason that they're spread that way is not an accident, as we'll see here in a minute. We look at their history. They were the bulwark against the Iranians for the Ottomans and the Ottoman Empire back in hundreds of years ago. Okay. What land did they control? This is before, of course, the current invasion, but you can see they were dominant in the extreme part of northeastern Syria, which is actually a very nice area. It's along the Tigris River, and it's pretty green and it's pretty arable, relatively arable for that area. And they stretch across most of that in a little group almost all the way over there to Aleppo. But they certainly didn't control that much land in the rest of Syria. And they have a very large area in Iraq, which they do call Kurdistan, but they don't want that to be the only Kurdistan. So it's kind of good to see where they controlled it. Of course, there's lots of them across the border in Turkey, but they don't control any of the Turkish areas. Okay, what do they want? This is important because, you've got to be clear about your goals. They want to start off with semi-autonomous homelands in each one of those states I showed you, particularly Iraq, in Syria and Turkey, and they'd like to stitch that together into, a non-irredentist state that they would call Kurdistan. Now, I've got the question, is that very realistic? Again, given international relations history, the answer is probably no, not while the current regimes are in power. The Rojava goals include political and religious tolerance, but I don't want to make them sound like they're nirvana. They have often pressed children under the age of 16 into military service. Right now, there are reports that they're pressing Christians under the age of 45 into service, but they do see this as an existential crisis. They think they're about to be overrun, so they are desperate. And I'm not excusing it, but there are things certainly that are not great about what they're doing right now. Okay, here's just some big points about what their stated goals are. Political and gender equality, and in the Middle East, that's extremely rare. Going in at the bottom, female empowerment and prominent roles in leadership and the military. They're one of the few fully integrated militaries in the world. I think Sri Lanka and in Israel, one of the others that women serve in every capacity that men do in the military. So that they're certainly very involved in that. They also believe in land reform. They believe in even ecological preservation of northern Syria, although the tanks are not really doing great things to that right now, unfortunately. Nonpartisan judiciary. So they have a wonderful set of goals. A lot of this comes from an American philosopher, and I'll talk a little bit about him who influenced the PKK founder. We'll try to get to that. But if you want to read a beautiful defense of Rojava, there's a wonderful New York Times article in the handout I've got there. It's the piece by Krasinski, I believe, called "What Would Be Lost If the Kurds Are Kicked Out of Northern Syria?" And so for further reading, that really gives you a much richer idea of their political and economic goals. Okay, what do the other regional actors want? And I think what you'll see here is they're all getting exactly what they want in this deal. It's a win-win for all of them. Turkey wants to have a survival of the government. Now, just a couple of years ago, Erdogan came this close to being kicked out of the regime. It was an iPhone that saved him. It's a whole interesting story that if it weren't for his iPhone and FaceTime, he probably would have been kicked out. The military revolted. There was a widespread in civil society, teachers, everybody, they seemed to really want him out. But like a typical strong man, he had just enough loyalty in the military, he came flying back. But coups like that tend to do bad things to people who are already a little on edge, if you know what I mean. So Erdogan has been pretty draconian since then. Of course, he wants to punish the PKK, which has been a thorn in his side since 1984. By the way, there's only 4 dates I want you to remember. There'll be a quiz afterwards, right? 1923, 1984, 2005, and 2016. Those are the 4 dates. We're going to go over them. And relief from the immigrant influx. Now, here you can have some real sympathy for Turkey because of the butcher in Baghdad, because of Assad, destruction of his country. About 6 million people have fled, and most of them have gone through Turkey. They want to get to Europe, but then Europe made a deal with Erdogan that says, hey, we'll pay you if you'll keep some of these people back. Well, he's got about 2 million of those people that he's having to take care of with the EU help that he wants to get rid of, right? He wants to push them back into Syria. Well, this is the perfect place for him, right? Just dump them right back into North Syria, 2 million people, what could go wrong? So that's really his plan as well, and unfortunately it seems to be going the way he wants it. Of course, Putin never met an opportunity he didn't like for further aggrandizement. You can see him practically chuckling there on the video. Oh boy, you know, we got bases. This consolidates his bases in eastern Mediterranean. He's got them on the Mediterranean. Now he's got land bases. He's blowing up containment in a way that the Soviet Union never did, but that's a whole other story. But it's amazing how he's been able to take advantage of these opportunities. And of course, if you think about it, and this is the thing that Trump has said in the last week that he's concerned about, is that he would be able to control a lot of the access to oil. So as he gets further and further down, those strategic pathways get to be more under his control. He doesn't control the Gulf yet, but he's getting closer. Iran, of course, likes it as well because a regional foe, the Kurds, they're weak, and their position is being strengthened in relationship to Saudi Arabia, their sworn enemy. So they're liking this. They also have the ability now to meddle and strengthen their control of the entire Levant. Little geography, the Levant is basically all of the eastern Mediterranean. So go from Israel, Sinai, all the way up to Turkey and then over to Iran. That's the Levant, and then that goes all the way down to Iraq and then the Gulf. So they're getting more and more power in the Levant. And Syria, even though he seems to be upset in that video, it's kind of a win for him because he's eliminating a very powerful internal check. The Kurds, they weren't entangled directly with them, but they were frankly a better fighting force than his own army. So he's not minding that so much. Okay, we got to move along quickly. And I say this is brief. The history of the Kurds starts in the year 612, right? 612, so right now we're in year 2607, I think we are, according to their calendar. Where do they come from? No one knows exactly. I've done a lot of reading. They like to claim the Medes, if you remember the Median Empire, way back when, Battle of the Assyrians, back about the 12th century before Christ. Like the French say, well, we come from the Gauls. Well, they like to say we come from those fierce Medians, and that's where they trace it. Who knows? The first time the Greeks, the first time you get something like Kurds is the Karduchoi, which the Greeks call them around the 5th century before Christ. So they're an old people. I mean, you get the point. They go way back. What's really interesting is the Ottoman Empire, and this shows you that the Turks and the Kurds have not always been enemies. For about 300 years, maybe 400 years, from 1500s through the late 1900s, the Kurds strategically allied, really became part of that diaphanous Ottoman Empire as the bulwark against the Iranians. They were fierce mountain fighters. Their Peshmerga goes way back when. And so they got the overall protection and trade that the Ottoman Sultan offered in exchange for a lot of autonomy. In fact, for a while there, they had something called Kurdistan, so they were not unhappy with that. However, as the Ottomans, the sick man of Europe, began to collapse in the late 19th century and are wiped out in World War then they become increasingly swept up with this nationalism as well. And that leads us to what I think is the real turning point. That's why I've got it just spinning crazily. So you wake up, people. We're almost there. Is the World War I. Of course, this is when Wilson and his idealism of the 14 points, open covenants, openly arrived at, no hidden codicils, and most important here, self-determination of peoples. That became, the exciting moment. Hey, we're finally going to be able to self-determine and be the Kurdistan we've always wanted to be. They were promised this in Section 111 of the Treaty of Sèvres in about 1920, coming out of the Paris Peace Conference. Unbeknownst to them, however, the British and the French had already said, we're going to carve this place up in the secretive Sykes-Picot Agreement. And then the Turks immediately went to war, said, no way, we're not having this. So after 3 years of war, the Turks, kind of what's left over of the Ottoman Empire, led by the Young Turks. Ever heard that? The Young Turks? These are the people you've heard of. Kemal Ataturk and his gang, they managed to nullify that, and they get their own Turkey and all these other states. There's no mention of the Kurds in this new treaty called the Treaty of Lausanne. This is the first time the Kurds feel like they've been betrayed, in the first of 8 times in the last 100 years. So you can see the history I just went over. But again, 1923 is one of those dates of infamy for the Kurds because they really thought they had from the U.S. and Woodrow Wilson their homeland, and unfortunately they did not. So they are also, of course, targeted by not just Turkey, but Iraq, Iran, and Syria. It's been really difficult in every state they've been in. And here is the 8 times they believe they've been betrayed just in the last 100 years by the United States. Fun times. That's why they have that poignant slogan there at the bottom, our only friends are the mountains. So when things really get bad, and they often do, they just retreat up into the mountains and regroup, and then they come back. And I think they're going to do it again, but we shall see. 1923, we've already mentioned, Turkey and the UK conspire against them, the Treaty of Lausanne. The United States fails to intervene. We didn't join the League. 1963, the dictator of Iraq, Qasim, we, along with others, joined to push him out with the Kurds' help. We then forgot about them. 1973, this was when Kissinger is trying to work with the Shah of Iran and Hussein to kick out another government. That worked out, and then the moment we got that done, we once again forgot about them. This is when Kissinger made the famous statement, we don't do charity work here. So too bad, we don't do charity work. And they remember this sort of thing. 1980s, of course, Hussein used them against the Iranians. Then he gassed them. 1991, again, with Hussein. We promised under George H.W. Bush that we would help them out. They helped us against Hussein. They did help us get rid of him, and then we forgot about him. The mid-1990s, Turkey attacked, but then they backed off. They had a little period of liberalization. In 2007, Turkey went into Iraq and attacked them there. And then, of course, what we just had on October the 9th, Turkey in Syria. So 8 times they have been used and then discarded. And it's a pretty sad history. So it didn't just happen yesterday. It's happened 7 times previous to that as well. Okay, recent history. Only 3 acronyms I want you to really remember. The PKK and the YPG. The PKK is the Kurdish Workers' Party. They were a Marxist-Leninist party founded by Mohammed Öcalan, 1984, using all the Marxist-Leninist Maoist techniques of subversion, of using the cellular structure, propaganda. Unfortunately, they were very effective, and it was a very bloody conflict. And this, you might have a little sympathy for the Turks, because 50,000 people have died since 1984 with the PKK against the Turks. And then, they do go back over the border with Iraq and with Syria. And so the Turks get really frustrated. You come over here, you do an attack, and then you retreat behind another nation's walls. In the mid-2000s, the aughts, Öcalan kind of converted, if you will, away from communism to this libertarian communitarianism. Boy, I wish we had more time to talk about these fun ideas. And who says an obscure academic like me doesn't have an influence? This is a poor guy, Murray Bookchin, who was interesting. A few people knew him, but he died in obscurity 10 years ago. And he had a really interesting set of ideas. And so from his ideas came this social contract that talked about religious tolerance, which I think is really important, about not having capitalism is basically okay, and not having a hierarchical top-down structure. That it was a connection, it was a confederation, if you will, of municipalities that wanted to promise these ideas. They had a university in, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Kimlan, which has now been taken over by the Turks, where they promoted these ideas of the social contract. The Kurds, of course, became part of our U.S. GWAT, the Global War on Terror, and they were key in not just containing or destroying ISIS, but other groups as well. And there were two really effective groups, the Peshmerga, the ancient fighting force in Iraq, and the YPG, which is the fighting force in Kosovo, in northern Syria. What Erdogan says is the YPG and the PKK are essentially the same thing. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but there's no difference in his mind. That's why he calls them all terrorists. You might remember that from that mountaintop in Iraq, the Yazidis were freed by the Kurds. So they were the real heroes for the United States and the GWAT in rescuing and being an effective fighting force in this area where we didn't want to send our own people, right? Obama didn't want to, Bush didn't want to, Obama didn't want to, Trump didn't want to. And so why not let the Kurds do it for us, because they're just so good at this kind of thing. So they were the heroes until we forgot about them. Turkey then, under Erdogan, this again shows you it hasn't been hundreds of years of conflict. Trump said this last week, just technically not true. The Turks had a long time of peace and trying to negotiate with the Kurds, after their conversion to the social contract from 2009, 2015. Erdogan thought things could be peaceful. For various reasons, the coup and his frustration with the cross-border incursions, he broke it off in 2015. And frankly, again, the PKK said Kurdistan is non-negotiable, and so that was a real problem on their side as well. They did establish this functioning quasi-state, Rojava, in northern Syria, roughly about that time, 2006 to present. There have been complaints again about child soldiers, but it was a time of stability, of peace for that region until the recent incursion. They were wise to avoid direct conflict with Assad. Even after he started to crack down in 2011, they wisely said, okay, we have other things to do, we're not going to attack you. All right, so how did this invasion make a bad situation worse? Well, it's kind of obvious, but you may have forgotten how many people were already there who were displaced and refugees before this incursion. There were about 100,000 refugees, about 15,000 of them were hardened ISIS fighters, and a lot of them are the families. And you can see by the concentric circles how big these camps were. The one over there on the right had about 60,000 people in it. It is a city. And there are pictures of it on the web you can see, and it's pretty nice, relatively speaking. No one wants to live in a camp, but they do have semi-permanent structures. And the Kurds were really doing yeoman service, being paid by us and a few other organizations, to take care of these displaced people, mostly from Assad, but others streaming across the border. So we've already got a humanitarian crisis. This map is going to show you that there were, I think, about 2.4 million people already desperately, in need of humanitarian assistance. They needed food, they needed water, they needed shelter. Most of them were more, you can see here, this is more in the northwestern part. They're more in the northeastern, but still, these people were just desperate. As he scrolls down there, you'll see some of the raw numbers. This is from the UN, by the way, pretty reliable statistics. About 4 million that are in bad straits, 2 million internally displaced people in northwest Syria, 400,000 have been displaced since May, and this is before, again, the current incursion. 2.7 million people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. This is before the invasion, 2.7 million people there. So we're adding all the crisis and the tragedy of what's going on now. This next one is, this next map is in your handout, and it may not go, you can see what's happened since October the 9th. People are scattering. They're going everywhere they can. Now, remember how bad it was already in northeastern Syria. Well, it's relatively not as bad. So some people from the invasion area right in the middle, about Ras Al Ain, they're now going to the east. Others are going into Iraq. Not as many as you would think, and others are just coming on down south. Of course, why? Because if you go over international borders, you may not be able to get back. So I think a lot of them are hoping this will blow over, but I'm not so sure that's going to happen. Okay, here are just some facts. You've got quite a few there on the handout. About 215,000, almost 250,000 people were directly displaced as a result of the October 9th invasion. About half of those, a little less than half, 106,000, have come back, but they're now having to come back to places under Turkish and Russian control. So that's very difficult for them. As of October 31st, just a few weeks ago, 13,000 Syrians have gone over into Iraq. 3/4 of them are women and children. As winter approaches, they're pretty desperate for shelter. There's been a 20% hike in food prices just since October the 9th. A huge group, 460,000, have been without water since the main water plant. This is in just the eastern, the eastern part of that area at Al Hasake. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that water station has gone offline. And this is straining already existing camps. This comes directly from the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So these are pretty reliable statistics. That's a pretty bad humanitarian catastrophe. Okay, just a little more history, and I wish I had several nights, but we're just going to do the first phase and the last phase to show you, this is the rise of Arab nationalism. What I have bolded here was the Truman Doctrine. As the result of the Soviet interference in Iran, we declared, kind of putting the meat on the bones of the self-determination, that we would help oppressed people everywhere. That became part of the stated U.S. doctrine. And so people, again, tend to rely upon those strong statements in U.S. policy. Some other interesting things that occurred, I'm not going to dwell on them. Of course, the Arab-Israeli War, 67, 73, that's what's tended to keep our attention focused away from the Kurds. There have been so many crises, so many other things going on that, Americans have a pretty narrow bandwidth when it comes to foreign policy, right? We can handle one crisis at a time, and we've tended to forget about them and all these other things. Of course, the Arab oil embargo. Now let's get to where we were. As I mentioned, Syria, 2011, this is the real current crisis. As a result of the Arab Spring, this unexpected bottom-up uprising toward greater civil society that began in Tunisia in 2010 and still is going on pretty well there. Tunisia is about the only success story there. Spread to Egypt, remember Tahrir Square, spread to other states. Syria looked like it was the same thing was going to happen. There was a sham election where Assad was the only candidate. He won 97% of the vote. I don't know how. So people knew that was completely a sham. They rose up, and as the Baathists and Hussein did, he just began to brutally put them down, attacking Damascus, Aleppo, tragedy after tragedy. We've lost count because, frankly, the Syrian Observatory, the main, cannot really get in to do great counts. The last time they did a good count was about a year and a half ago. We were about 420,000 dead directly as a result of his brutality. We can easily say that there's over 450,000 now. That's one of the great tragedies of world history, frankly, that many people dead. About half the country is either fled or internally displaced. There was a pre-war 22 million. About 12 million people have either fled the country or are internally displaced. This is a catastrophe by any stretch. Why did it happen? Lots of blame to go around. We can talk about it. I personally think Obama made a huge mistake when he didn't enforce when the chemical weapons were used. He didn't enforce the red line that he himself had there, and Assad is still in power. So we've had this widespread fallback. The Iranians have led this counter movement. They're loving the fact that it's failing in these places. They don't want democracy and freedom. We're still trying to figure out what's going to go on in Afghanistan. Lots of problems still in the Middle East. There's still a lot of underdevelopment. I wish we had time to talk theory. I had 3 slides of just of theory, 6 different theories. But one of the interesting ones is modernization theory that says that when you have a disjunct in development in different sectors in different countries, you're going to have conflict. And that the Kurds have often developed faster than other areas in these countries, and therefore it leads to conflict just on that. But there's so many other interesting ways we can predict pretty safely there's going to be continuing conflict in the Middle East. Irredentism, of course, we still have the Palestinians without a homeland, the Kurds, and a few others. The United States has been involved militarily, but we found out that the military can do important, indispensable things, but it can't take the place of diplomacy, and it can't create long-lasting settlements. Okay, so let's the return questions. We've got 11 minutes. We've got plenty of time to talk about this. Are the Kurds just another Middle Eastern tribe? What do you all think? And did the lights come on? I don't know if they're bright. They can be, but she wants to take some pictures while we're having our discussion. Are they just another one of these tribes?
Well, you said they're not Arabs, so what are they?
They are a Indo-Iranian, kind of a combination between European and Iranian. Remember the Iranians are not. Yeah, they're Persian. They're not Arab either. And that's one reason that the rest of the Arab world often, goes against them. So they really are descended from the Indo-Iranian group, and that makes them non-Arab and somewhat more closely related to the Iranians and these other mountain-dwelling people than the other groups. Yeah. 25, 30, 40 million of them? Not a small group, are they? So we probably can agree that they're not somebody we can or should easily forget, being that many people. What do you think about their goals in the social contract? Interesting. Any thoughts about that? Does that make them better or worse, or we shouldn't be influenced by their stated goals?
I think they're dreaming.
I think they're kind of dreaming, yeah. Are they dreaming because of the social contract or because of the Kurdistan idea?
I don't know. I wouldn't say they should be applauded for the social contract, but it's not realistic. I think it's just, they're never going to be able to achieve it.
Certainly not without their own state. They can't achieve it, right? So, yeah. Maybe in the semi-autonomous homeland you might be able to achieve some of that, but there would have to be some pretty strong power up top that would keep the other states from, invading or taking it away. That's a good point. Okay. How do we see their plight in international relations perspective? Is it something that, and this kind of goes along with these next few questions, do we see this more as a question of liberalism or of realism? It's a classic international relations split, right? Liberalism is like Wilson and Truman, where we believe the power of our example, spreading democracy, is going to win more people to our side. That with economics and free trade, more people are going to want to be part of our big tent. And we can point to a lot of successes, right? The post-World War II prosperity is basically these liberal ideas in action. Or do we want to go back to that older European realist balance of power, right? That we should have, not too much imbalance of power, and power should balance power. What do you think about our principles? This is big stuff, right? But what do you think the Kurds, are they something that distracts us from a realist balance of power like Kissinger would say? Or are they an example or an opportunity for us to show the power of our ideals in action? Could be, okay.
It seems to me we've been trying to put our ideas in action since 2002. And I think, I know I have a son that has been deployed over there 4 times. It's not clear to me that that's particularly realistic. I mean, we would like to bring our principles and ideals to a group of people that are tribal and exploitive and all the kinds of things that are part of it. But that hadn't been a recipe for success in 20 years. So, I would love for that to be the case. I certainly had hopes when this whole conflict started that maybe we could make a difference. But, you look at Afghanistan and that's a mess. Where a lot of time and treasure and young men and women have given their lives, and we don't have much to show for it.
That's very poignant, and you have a great insider perspective. But if we were to go to realism, then would we be doing what we're doing now? Yeah. Mm.
It seems like they both come into this discussion because, and I don't know much about it, but having read a little bit of the paper, there is both this kind of honor that they've been our partners, and that's an issue for not abandoning them and for the honor of our partnerships, right? But it's also they've been strategic allies in the fight against ISIL. And so that seems to be very realistic, that for me, Afghanistan and Iraq were slightly different conflicts. If Afghanistan was more about attacking ISIL or dealing with the Taliban, and this I see a little bit of, there's a realist about we can't solve the Middle East, and why are we still putting all of our money and all, I think President Trump's argument. But at the same time, I think there is a realist argument about that this is an ally in a global conflict that has hurt us. And so I don't know, does that make sense?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense, and that's the question about, so if you want to take that realist perspective, you got to think strategically. Yeah. And I'm not seeing a lot of strategic thinking, frankly. You've got to have lines of defense, you've got to have access, ports, bases and so forth. And when you have a proven ally, you probably should try to keep that going with, relatively small number of soldiers.
Or is that, you will know better than we do, has that been overstated in the media that maybe the Kurds have not played such a big role in the war on terror? And I mean, I only know what I read in the paper. Have they been strategically beneficial in that conflict?
Well, I think hugely beneficial, especially as we drew down, they were the ones carrying the fight forward in both Iraq and in Syria and in elsewhere, that we, decided we're getting tired of this, and it's understandable. So we kind of got a lot of foreign policy on the cheap with them. You had a thought over there? Yeah.
Because we're speaking strictly, because to me, they're in the hard place of they've been so great and useful to so many powers over time. It almost seems like they're offering the best of what they can offer in hopes of gaining clout. And they just had no luck in securing that this century. Yeah. Whereas from the American perspective, it's like, it would make, they've served that role to us numerous times in recent decades, it would make sense to serve their interests. But if serving their interests means drawing additional ire in a region whose established states cannot agree with each other and seem to advance themselves, they're another layer, they're just another layer of conflict to deal with.
That's absolutely true. So I think that gets to our final questions, which we have to do, but just in the interest of time. That first one I don't think we're going to really be able to talk much about, but it's really this question, I think, that kind of gets to the heart of what we've just been talking about. Is there a better way to structure power transitions in war-torn areas? We're always going to have war-torn areas. The Bible says that, and international relations says that's true. So when we know that we no longer want to spend the kind of blood and treasure we have been spending, is there a way to withdraw without creating these huge implosions and massive disruptions, humanitarian crises? And I would suggest that there are. I would suggest that there's at least two things we could have done maybe a little differently. Maybe we can do it again differently in the future. If you want to go the more realist perspective, then you can have the U.S. as the honest broker to say, okay, we understand the Turks do have some good points, the PKK and the terrorism and the cross-border, that's been a problem, but so do the Kurds. And so we're not going to, withdraw our troops and say, have at it. We're going to create a buffer ourselves, and we're going to be the honest broker to transition to a better state of the peace. It's not going to be perfect, but it's certainly going to be better than what's occurring now. And we're going to, of course, make sure that the humanitarian crises are as limited as possible. More broadly speaking, we could do truly international, multilateral, many-sided groups. If it doesn't, I think it could be the UN, but it could be some other group. It could be a combined UN, EU, number of people where we can spread the burden, because it costs us pennies on the dollar to support peacekeeping operations. We spent $1 trillion or so in Iraq. we've only spent a few $1 billion over the entire time of UN peacekeeping. So it's just a much, much less expensive way. And if there was an international administration, it wouldn't just be the U.S. versus or the Russians versus. It would spread out the burden. The peacekeepers generally like to have the money that they get for these peacekeeping missions. Would it be easy? Absolutely not. But at least it would give the worldwide stamp of approval and avoid the kind of international humanitarian crisis we're currently experiencing. But it would take creative diplomacy, and yes, it would really take U.S. leadership. These things simply don't happen unless the U.S. gets front and center with the Secretary General and says, we will put a few $1 billion, we'll lead the way for this. I would suggest that's simply a much better way to handle this kind of thing. And we're going to see it in Latin America, we're going to see it in Africa, but particularly with the Kurds, I think they frankly deserve better than what they've gotten. All right, that's all we've got time for. Any other comments, thoughts?
I agree with you.
Okay, thank you.
Trying to find some way to take care of these folks. We've got all sorts of autocracies and dictatorships, so we want to make all the rules. But we should not give up on Kurds.
I think so. Of course, it happens to go along with my Christian beliefs as well, that these people deserve some help, and they deserve the best that we can offer, and this is, why we created these institutions in the first place. There is a group of evangelical Presbyterians who are there. I can give you their information, if you'd like some more follow-up on that. What they suggest right now in their newsletter is to pray and to contact your member of Congress. Let your voices be heard that way. Just last Friday, there was an intense exchange between Senator Graham and the President Erdogan, who was visiting. So I don't know what that did, but at least, he knows that we don't all agree with what he's doing in there. Yes, Ms. Judah. Right, and this is the problem with the Russians taking over. They say, well, we're great. Well, we have pretty good evidence that they deliberately targeted a major hospital, resulting in terrible casualties and, of course, the ability to treat other casualties. So the Russians are not the world's best peacekeepers, frankly. We have a lot of evidence of that, yeah. Thank you.
The campaign for Van Dorn President 2020.
Everybody give me a big wave. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.